Story 1. The Unseen Presence. When I first started my career as a hospice nurse, I worked in a nursing facility for 2 years before transitioning to home hospice care. If you're a patient with less than 6 months to live, you can choose hospice care. My job was to ensure you aren't in pain, providing guidance to your family on how to administer medications and take care of you at home. For the first 8 years of my hospice career, I worked the night shift, and in all that time, I had never encountered anything unsettling until one fateful night. I received a call at 11 o'clock about an 84-year-old patient who had passed away at home. She had been suffering from a brain tumor. Since I didn't know this patient personally, I didn't have much information about her. I was just filling in for the night. When I arrived, the grandson, Jacob, greeted me and led me down the hallway to the bedroom. As we walked, I confirmed the name of the deceased on the paperwork, but I still asked Jacob what his grandmother's name was, just to make sure I had the right person. "Wanda," he replied, before returning to the living room. I opened the bedroom door slowly. The room was cold, likely because the windows were open. This was a Catholic family, and they believed that opening windows allowed the soul to leave the house after death. Inside the room, I saw 2 elderly people in the bed, an elderly man and a woman. The woman was lying still, her lifeless body held gently by her husband, who was clearly heartbroken. When I entered, the man looked up and then slowly got up, sitting in a chair by the bed. I greeted him, but he only gave me a small, distant smile, looking down as if lost in thought. I checked Wanda and confirmed that she had passed no heartbeat, no breathing. Her husband, William, was in a state of quiet grief. I glanced at the paperwork again. It said William had dementia, and Jacob, his grandson, would be the one to sign the necessary documents. I walked out into the hallway, closed the door softly behind me, and made my way to the living room. There, Jacob was sitting with an elderly man. I walked over, introduced myself, and shook the man's hand. "This is Wanda's husband, William," Jacob said, introducing the man sitting next to him. My heart stopped. "William?" But I had just left him in the bedroom. "Grandpa, this is the nurse. She came while you were in the bathroom," Jacob explained. I stared at the man sitting in front of me, the same man I had just left in the bedroom. I was rattled, but I carried on, completing the necessary paperwork. After a few minutes, I offered to call the funeral home for them. Jacob asked me to make the call, and I did. The funeral home assured me they'd arrive within 20 minutes. Afterward, William requested one final moment alone with Wanda. Jacob helped his grandfather to his feet and guided him back to the bedroom. I followed them, but when we entered, the room was empty. Only Wanda's body remained, alone in the bed. I felt a chill run down my spine. I quickly asked Jacob if he and his grandfather would be okay on their own, to which he assured me they would be. He thanked me as I left the room. I walked back to my car, trying to make sense of what had just happened. As I sat in the car, I checked the paperwork once again. It said Wanda was a widow, remarried to William. A few weeks prior, the nurse who had been attending to Wanda noted that during her episodes of confusion, Wanda often spoke of her late husband, Noah, who had died years ago. The realization hit me hard, and I sped off, shaken to my core. That was my only encounter with the unknown. Story 2. The Teddy Bear's Return. One of the most heartbreaking situations I've faced as a nurse involved a young child named Hannah. Hannah was born with a rare blood vessel disease called vasculitis, which prevented her body from getting adequate blood flow. The doctors informed her parents early on that their baby wouldn't survive long. They named her Hannah, and her parents showered her with love every day. In the hospital, They had made a special exception. Hannah was allowed to have a little doll in her crib, something we normally don't allow. They had decorated her room with care and affection, but as the months passed, Hannah's condition worsened. The parents requested to take her home, knowing she would die there, surrounded by their love. I had been Hannah's nurse from the very start. I had formed a close bond with her mother, who was kind and gentle. Before they left for home, I wrapped Hannah in a soft baby blanket, placed her in the car seat her parents brought, and set her tiny teddy bear beside her. Before leaving, Hannah had a small vomiting episode, and some of it landed on the teddy bear. I wiped it off as best as I could, not thinking much of it at the time. I took a few days off work, but one Saturday, I was in my backyard watering my plants when something caught my eye. There, leaning against one of my flower pots, was a small teddy bear. I froze. It looked identical to Hannah's, same color, same small size. Even more unsettling, there was a small patch of dried vomit on it, in the exact spot I had wiped it off before. How did it get here? I had no idea. I called the hospital unit and asked to speak with my supervisor, who gave me Hannah's mother's phone number. When I reached her, she was crying, but she stopped suddenly when I told her about the teddy bear. "That's Hannah's bear," she said softly. "We've been looking for it. We were hoping to have it with her at her funeral." Her voice then shifted. "I think Hannah wants you here," she said. "You took such good care of her. If you can, please come." With trembling hands, I brought the teddy bear to the funeral. When I arrived, I placed it gently beside Hannah's tiny coffin. I didn't believe in spirits or ghosts, but in that moment, something inside me changed. Maybe, just maybe, Hannah had reached out to me. I returned her bear to her as my final goodbye. Story 3. The final days, I once cared for an elderly patient who had been admitted to the hospital for difficulty breathing. His body had begun to retain excess water, and his kidneys had shut down. The doctors told his family that dialysis could buy him some more time, but after a few sessions, the elderly man refused further treatment. Without other options, his family decided to bring him home on hospice care. This is the harsh reality of aging. Our bodies wear down, our organs fail, and sometimes no amount of medical intervention can save us. But as a hospice nurse, it was my job to ensure the patient's final days were peaceful and free from pain. It was a difficult, yet rewarding part of my job, and it was in these moments that I saw the true vulnerability of the human spirit, as well as its strength. The hospice nurse's terrifying encounter. It was a quiet morning when I received the call about the elderly man. I work as a hospice nurse, and it's a job that requires compassion, patience, and a deep understanding of the delicate balance between life and death. On that morning, I was told to visit an elderly man who had been suffering from severe health problems. His family had asked for hospice care because he was nearing the end of his life. I grabbed my bag, gathered my supplies, and headed out for what I thought would be just another day on the job. When I arrived at the house, I was greeted by his granddaughter, Leah. She had been caring for him for some time, and I could tell from the look in her eyes that she had been through a lot. She invited me in and led me to her grandfather's room. It was a quiet Monday morning, so most of the family was at work or school. Leah was the only one home to care for him. The elderly man was lying in his bed, struggling to breathe. He was weak, his body frail from years of suffering, but when I approached him, he managed to greet me with a soft voice. I could see the pain in his eyes, and I knew the road ahead would not be easy for him. I set my bag down, ready to do what I could to ease his discomfort. He had a wound on his right foot that needed to be cleaned and dressed, and I knew it would be painful. I explained to him that I was going to give him some pain medication to help him relax before I started the procedure. As I administered the medicine through his foreline, I noticed something odd. His eyes were glazed, and his voice became strained as he whispered, "Wife, don't do that to him. He's just here to help me. Please don't." I froze for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no one else in the room but the elderly man and me. I glanced around, confused and slightly unnerved. "What do you mean?" I asked softly. He repeated his words. "Wife, don't touch them. You don't know what those are." His voice was desperate, as if pleading for me to understand something I couldn't. As a hospice nurse, I've encountered many situations where patients, especially in their final days, see things that others cannot. Sometimes these visions are hallucinations brought on by medication, and sometimes they seem to be more spiritual. I've heard patients talk about their loved ones who have passed, speaking to them as if they were still present. It's a phenomenon that I've come to accept as part of the mysterious process of death. But this felt different. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I started to unwrap the dressing on his foot, trying to focus on my task, despite the unsettling feeling in my gut. That's when he spoke again, this time more urgently. "Wife, you don't know what those are. Don't touch them." I tried my best to ignore the unease creeping up my spine and continue with my work. I finished cleansing his wound and was about to wrap it up with fresh dressing when something strange happened. My new roll of dressing and my scissors items I had placed on a chair to my right were suddenly gone. I searched the room, feeling my anxiety grow. The room was small, and there was nowhere for the items to have gone. After a few moments of frantic searching, I spotted the scissors and the roll of dressing on the carpet under the bed on my left. My heart skipped a beat. How had they moved there? The room was small, and I was the only one in it. There was no way they could have simply fallen off the chair and ended up there. I bent down to pick up the items, my hands shaking slightly. I glanced under the bed, half expecting to see something that would explain the strange occurrence. But there was nothing. The air felt thicker, heavier, as if the very atmosphere of the room had changed. I didn't want to stay in there any longer than I had to, but I quickly finished dressing his wound, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. When I finished, I returned to the living room to speak with Leah. I reassured her that I had taken care of her grandfather and told her that if they had any concerns later, they should call. I didn't mention the strange occurrences I had experienced, unsure of how to explain what had just happened. That night, at around 3 o'clock, I received a call that the elderly man had passed away. I had expected it to some extent. Without dialysis, his time had been limited. But even so, I wasn't prepared for the emotional impact of his death. It left me with a sense of unease, like I had witnessed something that transcended the physical realm. I couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't been alone in that room when he passed. The unanswered questions. I work on a medical surgical floor where I see a variety of patients with different conditions. However, this next story is something that I'll never forget. It started when I heard from my parents that one of our grandfathers, living in another city, was seriously ill. They told me he had been in the hospital for some time, suffering from a severe infection in his stomach. He had been experiencing bloody diarrhea, a symptom of a potentially life-threatening condition. As the only person in the family who worked in healthcare, my parents asked me to join them at a family meeting to discuss his condition. We made the trip to the family house, and once there, I learned more about the situation. The doctors had diagnosed him with a severe bacterial infection in his stomach, which had caused the bloody diarrhea. At this point, the infection had become so bad that antibiotics alone weren't enough to treat it. The doctors had recommended a procedure known as a fecal transplant, where healthy bacteria from a donor's stool would be inserted into his colon to help restore balance and fight the infection. I explained this to the family, reassuring them that it was a relatively safe procedure, even though it sounded unpleasant. Despite my attempts to explain the procedure, my grandfather refused it. He was adamant that he wouldn't go through with it. He even told me that if I insisted on the procedure, I could have it done on myself, but he wouldn't let anyone else do it to him. His refusal was frustrating, but it was his choice. What followed was even stranger. As he lay in his hospital bed, he warned me that if he died without undergoing the procedure, he would come back to haunt me. I tried to push those words from my mind, chalking it up to the delirium of someone who was severely ill. But when he passed away 4 days later, the events that followed left me questioning whether there was more to his warning. The strange occurrence at the funeral, the first night of my grandfather's funeral, I couldn't attend because I had work. When I got home later that evening, I was greeted by an awful smell. It was pungent, almost like rotten gas, and it lingered in the air, heavy and oppressive. I couldn't figure out where it was coming from. I checked the house, looking for any source of the smell, perhaps a dead rat or something similar, but there was nothing. The house was silent, but the smell was unmistakable. I decided to take a shower to clear my mind. But as I was washing, I began to hear strange sounds. Objects falling off the walls, glass breaking. My heart raced. I hurried out of the shower, my mind racing with dread. When I went into the hallway, I saw that 2 pictures had fallen from the wall. The glass was shattered, and both pictures featured my late grandfather. It was unsettling. I tried to reason with myself, telling myself it was just an accident. Maybe the pictures had loosened over time. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next 2 days passed without incident, but on the 3rd night, I went to the funeral. I knew it was the last night, and I decided to attend, despite my lingering unease. When I arrived, I noticed the smell again, the same foul odor I had encountered at home. As I approached the coffin to take a quick look at my grandfather, the smell grew stronger. When I looked inside, I was struck by the same scent. It was as if his presence was still there, lingering in the air, refusing to leave. I didn't stay long. I returned home, shaken by what I had experienced. Months later, I finally shared my experiences with my parents. We all agreed that the strange occurrences could have been tied to my grandfather's refusal of the procedure. Maybe he had wanted to prove a point, to show us that his spirit was still around, even in death. But no matter what explanation we settled on, I could never forget the unsettling feeling I had that night at the funeral. The smell, the broken pictures, and the presence I couldn't explain. Closing thoughts. These stories are just a few of the strange, unexplainable things that have happened to me during my time as a hospice nurse and a family member dealing with loss. Whether it's the quiet presence of spirits or the eerie events that happen after death, I've come to accept that there is more to life than what we can see or touch. There are forces at work that we may never understand, and sometimes it's best to let them be. Thank you for joining me as I shared these stories. I hope they have left you with something to think about. After all, we never really know what lies beyond the veil.